They knew it was coming. They ran the simulations. They wrote the reports. They sat in those rooms and watched the numbers climb. And then they did nothing. When the water finally came, it didn't knock. It didn't warn. It simply arrived. And by the time most people understood what was happening, there was nowhere left to run. This isn't just the story of a hurricane. This is the story of a city that was quietly condemned, decades before a single storm cloud ever formed. Late August, the Gulf of Mexico. The air is thick, the water is warm, dangerously, unusually warm. And somewhere out over that dark expanse of open ocean, something is building. Something patient, something massive. Its name is Katrina. But here's what most people never truly understood about what happened next. The hurricane was never really the weapon. The weapon had already been loaded. It had been sitting there for 40 years, rusting quietly beneath the streets of one of America's most beloved cities, waiting for exactly the right moment to fail. What you're about to hear is the full story. The storm, the silence before it, the catastrophic collapse that followed, and the uncomfortable truth that the people in charge knew every single detail of what was coming, and chose to look the other way. To understand August 29th, 2005, you first need to understand something strange and almost unbelievable about the city of New Orleans. It shouldn't exist. Not where it does, not the way it does. Wedged between the massive sprawl of Lake Pontchartrain to the north and the snaking curve of the Mississippi River to the south, New Orleans occupies a piece of geography that defies logic. Much of the city rests below sea level. In some neighborhoods as much as 10 feet below the waterline. Not slightly below, not borderline. 10 feet. That's above your head. That's above your ceiling. The only thing standing between the city and the surrounding water, the only reason New Orleans was still there at all, was an enormous, aging network of levees, floodwalls, and drainage canals that held everything back on every side, every single day, all year long, without rest. And for generations, it held. People lived there, raised families there, built an extraordinary culture there. Jazz drifting through iron-laced balconies. They had never been strong enough. Built in pieces across several decades by the US Army Corps of Engineers, the system had gaps, weaknesses, and design flaws that had been documented and reported and flagged over and over again, with almost no meaningful response. In 2004, just 1 year before Katrina, the federal government funded a disaster exercise called Hurricane Pam. Researchers modeled what would happen if a slow-moving Category 3 storm made a direct hit on the city. The results were staggering. Tens of thousands of deaths, near total submersion. A humanitarian collapse on a scale America had never seen. When they presented those findings to federal officials, the scientists weren't met with alarm or urgency. One researcher described the room this way. Officials in the back, laughing, dismissive, uninterested. He walked away feeling like the awkward outsider in the corner. The one nobody wanted to listen to. The information existed. The warnings were real. The failure was a choice. August 23rd, 2005. A disorganized tropical depression stirs to life in the southeastern Bahamas. Quiet, almost unremarkable at first. Within 24 hours, it becomes Tropical Storm Katrina. By August 25th, it makes its first landfall in South Florida. Still a Category 1, still containable, 14 people dead, and then it pushes west into the Gulf of Mexico. For a brief moment, it weakens over the coast, and then it hits the water. The Gulf in late August is essentially a furnace. Surface temperatures hovering around 30 degrees Celsius. Warm enough, deep enough, to act like rocket fuel for a tropical system that has nothing above it to slow it down. Upper-level winds pull heat out of the storm's core with almost mechanical efficiency, feeding the cycle, accelerating the violence. What follows is terrifying in its speed. August 27th, Category 3. Just after midnight, August 28th, Category 4. By 7 a.m. on August 28th, Katrina is a Category 5 hurricane. Maximum sustained winds of 175 miles per hour. Central pressure plunging to 902 millibars, one of the lowest ever recorded in the Atlantic Basin. One of the most powerful storms to exist in recorded American history, and it is pointed directly at New Orleans. At 10 a.m. on August 28th, Mayor Ray Nagin issues the city's first ever mandatory evacuation order. His voice carries the weight of a man who knows exactly what he's asking people to do, and knows that for many of them, it's already too late. This is a storm that most of us have feared. I do not want to create panic, but I want citizens to understand that this is very serious. Over 1 million people had already left in the days before, but hundreds of thousands hadn't. The elderly, the sick, those without cars, those without money, those who had ridden out storms before and believed they could do it again. For all of them, the evacuation order wasn't a solution. It was a sentence. That same afternoon, meteorologists at the National Hurricane Center issued bulletins that read less like weather forecasts and more like dispatches from a future they were desperately trying to prevent. Water levels that could overtop levees. Human suffering described as incredible. Survival conditions approaching impossible. The language was almost without precedent. But Katrina was already beginning to ease slightly as it moved over cooler coastal waters in the final hours before landfall. By the time it crossed the shore, it had weakened to a high-end Category 3. It didn't matter. The most lethal part of that storm, the massive wall of ocean water called the surge, had been built during the storm's Category 5 peak. That water was already in motion. It was already on its way. The weakening of the wind changed nothing about what was coming next. At 6:10 a.m., August 29th, 2005, Hurricane Katrina makes landfall near Buras, Louisiana, about 50 miles southeast of New Orleans. Central pressure at 920 millibars, fourth lowest ever recorded for a storm hitting the United States mainland. At first, cautious relief begins to spread through emergency channels. The eye had tracked slightly east of the city. The winds are brutal but survivable. The phrase "dodged a bullet" is spoken, quietly, carefully, as though no one wants to jinx it. They hadn't dodged anything. Before dawn had even fully broken, storm surge was already overtopping levees along the Mississippi River Gulf outlet. Then, around 5 a.m., on the east side of the Industrial Canal, the very waterway that engineers had long identified as the city's most dangerous vulnerability, a 30-foot section of floodwall gives way. Water begins to pour through. Then a second breach opens. Then another. Over the next 24 hours, more than 50 separate failures would be reported across New Orleans' levee and floodwall system. This was not a flood. This was a collapse. Systematic, cascading, and catastrophic. In the lower 9th Ward, People who had stayed in their homes woke up to walls of water arriving with almost no warning. Not a rising tide, not a slow creep. A surge chest high in seconds, then above the head. People lunged for their attics. They dragged children and elderly parents up through narrow openings in ceilings. They found themselves trapped in dark spaces as the water continued to climb toward them. Those who had something to cut with, axes, hatchets, anything, started hacking at the wood above them, trying to break through to the roof before the water took everything. Later, rescue teams would find axe marks carved into attic ceilings across entire neighborhoods. Desperate strikes cut into the wood from below, from the inside, from the dark. The marks of people trying to buy themselves one more minute. Some made it out through those holes, some didn't. By the afternoon of August 29th, 1 in 5 homes in New Orleans was underwater. By August 31st, it was 4 in 5. Entire neighborhoods weren't flooded, they were submerged. 15 feet of water where houses used to stand. The lower 9th Ward, Lakeview, New Orleans East, St. Bernard, Gentilly, gone. While the city drowned, tens of thousands of people converged on 2 locations: the Louisiana Superdome and the New Orleans Convention Center, because there was nowhere else to go. At the Superdome, around 15,000 people arrived hoping for shelter. What they found was a slow-motion humanitarian disaster unfolding in real time, broadcast live to the entire country. Food ran out, water ran out, toilets stopped functioning. The roof had been partially torn away by the winds, leaving gaps in the ceiling of a building packed with families trying to survive. People lay on concrete floors in 95-degree heat for days, waiting for buses that did not come, waiting for help that seemed to have forgotten them entirely. The federal response, slow, disorganized, and wildly unprepared for a catastrophe that FEMA's own simulations had laid out in explicit detail just 12 months earlier, became one of the most damaging institutional failures in modern American history. Outside, the city had become something close to apocalyptic. People spray-painted messages on their rooftops. They waved from second-story windows. They called family members in other states who called news stations, who called emergency lines, desperately trying to relay GPS coordinates for people stranded in flooded homes. One of the most haunting images to emerge was the sight of elderly residents, many of them without the means to have evacuated, sitting on elevated highway overpasses in the August heat, surrounded on all sides by water, waiting, days passing, the sun beating down, help not coming. Katrina did not kill randomly. Nearly half of all fatalities were people over 74 years old. Almost 40% drowned. The storm found the people who had the fewest options, and it consumed them. The final revised death toll, approximately 1,400 lives. In Louisiana alone, over 1,500 counted. More than 134,000 homes in New Orleans damaged. 70% of all occupied housing in the city. Damage totaling an estimated $125 billion. The population of New Orleans cut nearly in half, from 485,000 people before the storm to roughly 230,000 a year later. Half a city gone. In June 2006, the US Army Corps of Engineers did something remarkable. They told the truth. They officially acknowledged that faulty design specifications, incomplete construction, and substandard engineering had directly contributed to the catastrophic flooding of New Orleans. An analysis by the American Society of Civil Engineers confirmed what many had already suspected. 2/3 of the flooding could have been prevented if the levees had been properly built. Not all of it, but 2/3. More than 1,000 lives, hundreds of thousands of homes, half a city's population. 2/3 of that preventable. The federal government eventually committed over $14 billion to rebuilding and reinforcing the levee system. New floodgates, new surge barriers, new pumping stations. The infrastructure that exists today is substantially stronger than what stood on August 28, 2005. But whether it's enough, that question returns every single hurricane season. Quiet and persistent, like a city that has never quite been able to fully exhale. Katrina's name was officially retired in April 2006. It will never again be assigned to an Atlantic storm. 20 years later, New Orleans is still standing. The music still drifts down Frenchman Street on warm nights. The food is still unlike anything else you'll find in this country. The people rebuilt because that's what they've always done. Because they love that city in a way that is almost impossible to explain to someone who has never felt it. But the rebuilding was never equal. The neighborhoods that lost the most were the same neighborhoods that had always had the least. And in the empty lots of the lower Ninth Ward, in the streets that were repaired but never truly repopulated, the question lingers: was it ever really fixed? Or was it just covered over? Because here is the thing that history will not let go of. Katrina did not destroy New Orleans. The system destroyed New Orleans. A system of neglect, a system of dismissal, a system of warning signs that were read, understood, catalogued, filed, and then quietly ignored by the people whose job it was to act on them. The storm was the moment. The failure had been building for decades, and the people who paid the price for that failure were the ones who had always been most vulnerable, in a city that had always been one catastrophe away from the edge. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something, hit the like button. It genuinely makes a difference in whether these videos reach people who need to hear them. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. And next time, we go to Tuscaloosa, where people watched a mile-wide tornado approach live on television. And 6 minutes later, entire neighborhoods had vanished from the map.